All right, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. It looks like people have jumped in. So good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today and welcome in. My name is Travis Proctor. I'm the Director of Clinical Operations here at Citruslabs. We're very excited to have you all here today as we discuss the rise of science-backed brands and how to create research-backed product claims. Today's workshop and fireside chat will be led by Citruslabs' own co-founder and CEO, Susanne Mitschke. We also have here a special guest, Matt Crane, who's the co-founder and head of product over at Semaine Health. The workshop today will be split into 3 parts. First, Susanne will go ahead and introduce Citruslabs a little bit. For those of you unfamiliar with us, she'll do a quick brief description of the company and introduce us. Second, Matt will then go ahead and talk about Semaine a little bit and give a brief description of that company as well. And third part will be a fireside chat in which Susanne and Matt will cover important topics on clinical studies and consumer brands. Amongst others, things they'll discuss will be why brands like Semaine decided to invest in clinical trials, differences between clinical trials and consumer perception studies, best practices and how to design a clinical trial, best practices and also how to publish your clinical trial results, how to create claims that are based on research and data, and of course, a few extra topics as well. After the fireside chat has finished, Matt and Susanne will also take questions from you. So please use the Q&A feature in Zoom. There's also a chat function there as well, so you can go ahead and post questions in there if you want. Feel free to go ahead and throw questions in there as they're talking. We'll just keep in mind we'll get to everything once they're done. But all in all, we'll try and keep the workshop and fireside chat to about 40 minutes. And that's all from my side, and I'm going to go ahead and now turn it over to Susanne. Go ahead, Susanne.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Travis. And thank you all for joining us today. I'm thrilled that you are with us here. And again, my name is Susanne. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Citruslabs. And I don't want to bore you with a long intro, but I quickly would like to introduce Citruslabs and what we do before I give the word to Matt. And then we will start our chat. So Citruslabs is a digital CRO, a contract research organization with a specific focus on consumer brands. And our mission is to provide brands with affordable clinical trials to create research-backed product claims. We provide clinical trials as a service, which means that we don't just provide a technology platform for you to run your clinical studies, but you can actually outsource your whole clinical study to us from start to finish. Now, what does start to finish mean? It means that our service includes study design, it includes the creation of the clinical protocol, study material, IRB submission, participant recruitment, retention, compliance. It also includes data collection and analysis, and also the creation of a clinical study report. So effectively, we run the whole clinical study for you. Now, the type of studies we run varies quite a lot. It differs a lot from customer to customer. And we're also happy to help you find the right study design for your needs and the claims you would like to make. And to tell you a little bit more about the types of studies we run, I would quickly like to give you an overview, some comparisons as well, because this is the type of question I get a lot, right? What options do I have when I want to run a clinical study? And the short answer is that there are many different options, and the most popular ones I'm sharing with you now. Okay, so the most common study type we see is a single group clinical study in which there's just one intervention group and no control group or no placebo group. This study type is very cost effective and a good way to show efficacy. And in a single group clinical trial, you can use many different methodologies. The easiest is always questionnaires, validated questionnaires, study-specific questionnaires. Then you can use biomarkers. You can use blood draws, for example, digital biomarkers like blood pressure, weight. For skincare, you can use skin markers, hydration levels, severity of conditions like acne, fine lines, hyperpigmentation through expert skin grading, for example. And of course, you can also do before and after photos. Single group clinical trials go through an IRB, an ethics committee, and can be put on clinicaltrials.gov. And now the less scientific cousin of a single group study is a consumer perception study. Typically, consumer perception studies also have just one group, and they are asking for the perception of how consumers like the product. They are a lot less scientific than single group clinical trials. And you typically only use study-specific questionnaires. There's no IRB involved, but they are really a great way to create marketing claims. And in perception studies, you also don't use biomarkers typically, but you can absolutely use before and after photos. Now let's go to the randomized control family, short RCT. Yeah, the randomized control family, right? You have the advantages that we just talked about in a single group clinical study, but RCTs are seen as the gold standard in clinical research because they really give a more unbiased view of, if your product actually works. Here, studies typically have at least 2 study arms, right? Placebo-controlled, or there's an actual control group, which is a group that doesn't take any intervention or placebo. Or a study can even have 3 study groups, intervention, placebo, control group, for example. And you can also have a crossover design, the design that Matt and Semaine used, where you have only 1 study group, but this group goes through a control or placebo arm and then the intervention arm. However, crossover studies cannot be used by every brand. For example, skincare, it's typically getting a little bit tricky doing crossover design. Now, very important though, RCTs are more expensive than single group studies, and many brands don't need to run an RCT in order to show product efficacy or create claims. And a single group clinical trial is still a clinical trial. All right, so that's it from my side. I hope you have a good overview now about the different forms of clinical trials, and I give it over to Matt to introduce Semaine and his clinical study, and then I'm excited to talk to you, Matt.
Me too. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to kind of have this venue, and I'm really excited to talk to Citruslabs because I feel like you've done a great job of kind of pushing the envelope forward for clinical trials, especially for kind of wellness brands and kind of consumer brands in general. So I'm one of the co-founders of Semaine Health, and it's a French word, semaine, which means week, because it's really all about tackling problems for women's health. And we believe that kind of that menstrual cycle and kind of the hormonal cycle undergirds a lot of how you think about women's health. And so we like to think about ourselves as creating science-backed solutions and supplements for periods to menopause and kind of every UTI or issue in between. And like a lot of other people, it's like we, in the startup community, we saw a problem. And so this was really born out of necessity because my wife, Lauren, struggled for a long time with endometriosis, and her twin sister did as well, Catherine. And even, a number of surgeries, emergency surgery, endometrial removal surgeries. It had been a really big challenge because you've taken so many doses of kind of ibuprofen or non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs that over the years, kind of her stomach lining was completely shot. And, even now she can't take any sort of ibuprofen or NSAID. And so at the time I was actually working at the University of Washington's medical school, and kind of as her patient advocate, I started reading up on a lot of scientific journals on endometriosis, on clinical trials that have been done with plant extracts. And we developed a formula that was able to kind of alleviate her pain by on her period by addressing it kind of through an anti-inflammatory process with kind of gentler plant extracts. And so that was kind of the genesis of Semaine, because we realized that if it worked for her, if it worked for her sister, if it worked for, kind of this mini group of women that we put together to kind of test the product, then maybe there was a way that we could make a difference in women's health and kind of, drive it forward a little bit. And so everything that we do is really about addressing kind of underexplored and underutilized approaches for women's health, because if you're on this call, hopefully you know some of this, but women's health is really underinvested because a lot of doctors or PhDs or pharmaceuticals companies are run by people who look like older versions of me, right? And so generally, old white guys tend to be aware of old white guy problems, right? And so they just put more money towards those sorts of issues, testicular or erectile dysfunction, compared to something like dysmenorrhea or painful periods, which addresses it affects a really, really significant portion of the population. And so the whole idea about Semaine is that we are trying to address these challenges that women face with really rigorous testing, with clear, direct solutions that are all natural, right? And so we want our products to be able to be purchased off the shelf without a prescription in kind of this way, to meet women where they are and where they're consuming products in a way that is very, very efficacious. And that's one reason we want to marry this sort of like natural approach that is very, very common with clinical efficacy. And so that's one reason, my background is a PhD in bioengineering, worked at lots of medical schools. And the formulation and testing process is really important to us because we came to this out of a desire for personal solutions and kind of, personal pain points. And so that's kind of how we design everything right now. And right now we're selling, we have two products. So the PMS and period support is actually what we'll be discussing because that was a clinical trial that just wrapped up with Citruslabs. And it's basically like a plant-based midol. And I think this is something really important when you think about clinical trials and also even just product design in general, is you want to meet your consumers where they are. And we knew that a lot of consumers don't like taking products all the time. And so we designed this PMS and period support to be like a plant-based midol that you could just kind of take when you're experiencing PMS or kind of, bloating or cramping symptoms. And then the hormone balancing, something I'm really excited about as well, because it's really designed about addressing metabolic hormones, which is something that's not thought about very much, but really designed to kind of go after insulin resistance and kind of support metabolic health in ways that have kind of knock-on effects for consumers and how they think about their skin or cravings or kind of stabilizing their mood. And right now, you can find us at Target, Thrive, Anthropology, our own website, of course. And we'll be launching a bunch of new locations over the next few months. So if you are curious and excited to find us at some drugstores or some great local grocery chains, then be on the lookout because we're trying to meet consumers where they are, every place they shop, and at an affordable price point. So we're really excited to be expanding our distribution a lot over the next 3 or 4 months.
Awesome. Thank you so much for this great overview. So when you talked about, that formulation and testing process is very important. Now, I know that you did some research in-house, right, before you actually worked with us. And can you tell us a little bit about the research you did in-house that you did, and then also how this research actually led to your first clinical study?
Absolutely. So for us, and I think for hopefully a lot of the brands that are on this call and thinking about it, of course, we start with, kind of published clinical research. So, get on Google Scholar, comb through all that data as well before you even develop a product. But then I think, there's a great, if you're a startup company, you're kind of pursuing this sort of lean startup idea. There's this idea of this, MVP or minimum viable product. And I think that's really important to take as well to your approach to clinical trials, because no clinical trial is going to answer everything. You don't want to go in with, a 1,000-person clinical trial when you don't know if even your product works at all, or you're designing the trial correctly, right? And so a lot of trials fail. This is true as well, even in the pharmaceutical space, because the trial was designed poorly. Not that the product doesn't work or that it won't work for some subset of people, but that the trial was designed not to focus on those people that it'll work with. And so for us, it's really important to make sure that that we kind of dog food or test our trial on ourselves, on our friends, on all those sorts of things. And so in the same way that when we launch an ad, right, we go to our friends, we ask them, would you mind being filmed in this ad? Would you mind if we took some pictures of your hands holding things, right? And if the ad performs well, then we do the same process of maybe getting some professional photographers or actors in to redo the same sort of angle on that ad. And so for the clinical trials, we recruited kind of a small internal group of people to basically test the product. do kind of a crossover trial, look at, responses. And so this wasn't something that is, scientifically valid or in the same sort of way as a full clinical trial, but it made sure that we weren't missing or overlooking any of the specific aspects.
That makes a lot of sense. And so can you elaborate a little bit why, you decided to actually invest in a full-blown clinical study? And, obviously I'm a little bit biased because, with Citruslabs, but now you are actually running your second study with us, right? And this is what makes me assume that your first investment was worth it. Right? But it would be great if you could just elaborate why you invest so heavily in actual clinical studies and don't just do like consumer perception studies, for example.
Oh, I'd love to, because I could talk about this a long time, and so because it's really fun, and I think we had to have some internal meetings because I kept being like, oh, we need to take more of our investor money and just put them in clinical trials, and everyone else in the company was like, no, we need to make sure we do ads too. So I really believe in clinical trials because there's something, and part of that comes back to our founding story and kind of what we are as a brand. Because for us, it's really important to not just to make products that are kind of beautiful and aesthetically pleasing, and that work well, but also that we can show they work well. And so we're raising the standard because our goal is really in the long term to be able to go to healthcare providers as well, and tell them that we've done these great clinical trials and that they should consider us as another option or tool in the treatment. So I think that clinical trials are great, but it is also a little bit with a caveat, kind of, because if it's not part of your brand or identity, then don't run a clinical trial, right? If your brand identity is to sell kind of an inexpensive product that is somewhat generic, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? That if you're just selling a generic product, then don't run your own clinical trials because it's not part of your brand identity. If your brand identity is to be more to provide real solutions and to persuade consumers that your product is unique and it is really beneficial, then I think there's a lot of marketing value because it aligns, the clinical trial aligns kind of with your core identity. And so I wouldn't encourage everyone to run clinical trials. I think the supplement and kind of wellness and consumer space would be a lot better if everyone ran clinical trials. But from a business angle, it needs to align with your brand. And I think especially for premium brands, it does align.
I agree. Yeah, I see a lot of, obviously a lot of companies, they are currently, identifying clinical studies, right, that we're researching parts of the ingredients of their products, right, which is great, but it's just not the same as if you would run, right, your own clinical study. Now, one thing you said is a lot of clinical trials fail because they are designed poorly. Now let's start here. So when you came to us, you already knew exactly what you wanted to do with your study. You came with us with the design that you wanted. I already mentioned that you did a crossover study. You had 58 participants. And can you explain a little bit what made you opt for the crossover study design and also how you decided on the number of participants?
Yeah, great questions. And that's and with most clinical trial aspects, there's a fair amount of science and then just a little bit of personal decision making in terms of the exact participant number. And so crossover trials, like Susanne mentioned, are really great because they give you the ability to have a participant experience kind of the baseline or no treatment or placebo, and then cross over and actually have an intervention treatment. And that's wonderful because it gives you a lot more statistical power. And so when you're coming down to it, if you have the same person kind of in a before and after treatment, then that gives you a lot more power for the same number of participants. And so, because if you're doing parallel arms, there's always some chance that those parallel arms are not actually identical in some way, but if the same participant experiences both a placebo and the intervention, or the baseline and intervention, then that's just a lot more powerful. And because the product we were looking at requires a fairly short intervention timescale. And so it's like a plant-based model, right? So it is something that you can take and experience a benefit relatively quickly. We didn't have to worry about running like a 3-month-long baseline of nothing and then a 3-month-long intervention as each of the 2 arms. And so for us, it was really easy because we could do kind of 2 different menstrual cycles, one without, one with. And that was a really easy way to do it. And it gave us a lot of statistical power. So I think if possible, I would really encourage you to do a crossover because I think crossover trials are great, but it does depend a little bit on your actual product.
I think also that crossover studies are really great. And I think this is something, especially if brands want to run an RCT, right? Crossovers are great because they also save cost, because the price of a clinical study is actually driven by the number of participants. And in a crossover study, you can double, right, the number, basically the participants, the data, right, by just having this one single group. But yeah, it does depend on the product. Typically what we are seeing is for skincare, it's getting a little bit tricky.
That's and especially for skincare or something like that, because you kind of need, if your intervention lasts a long time, then you need like a washout phase, right? Yeah. So it's like, then you need an extra month or something where the person isn't doing anything and then, tries the next stage of it. So that's where it can get tricky. But yeah, I think, and it's also nice too, because I think crossover trials are fairly, if you ever want to try and persuade a healthcare provider of kind of your results, they're just a little bit nicer. I don't know. They're just a little bit more statistically sound. And if you do anything like a power calculation to figure out the number of participants you need with a crossover trial, you just need fewer, right? Because you have the same data from every participant.
Yeah. Now let's move over to inclusion exclusion criteria. Exclusions, inclusions, they can also make or break clinical trials, right? Especially when it comes to the length of recruitment, when they're a little bit too tricky. So what is your take on that? How did you decide on your inclusions, exclusions, and what are your tips?
So I think, and the way to think about inclusion or exclusion criteria, I think, is just that you're formalizing ways of saying who your ideal customer is, right? And so if you have, for us, the product we're studying was 4 periods, right? So it's like, obviously that an age window, right? We wanted to make sure that, it wasn't a woman in her 60s who was being enrolled. But anything else you can do to kind of hone in on your ideal customer makes that a lot stronger. So I think if you can go back to your customer reviews or people you've talked to or tested your products and kind of find the people that have worked for the best, you want to find commonalities and use that to craft your inclusion exclusion criteria, with the caveat of being you don't want to be too specific. Because let's say your ideal customer who your product works the best for is someone who lives in Connecticut half the year and California half the year and is age 29 and a half, right? That's basically impossible to find people. And so that means that, Susanne would have to be, they're like unicorns, right? So if your inclusion exclusion criteria is way too specific, then it just makes your clinical trial cost go up because those people are impossible to identify. And so it's really this balance of finding your perfect customer who you want to include because they have your pain points, bad periods for us, bad bloating, bad cramps, mood swings, but also not someone who only has, off the charts pain levels or something like that, because then those people are just going to be harder to identify and kind of include in your trial.
Yeah, and also thinking about your customers, as you said, right? And your pool of customers is a wide net. So why would the pool of participants be only like a very small subset of your customer, right?
Absolutely, yes, yeah. So I think and I think it's like you want it to have a wide net, and a wide net of the people who like your product, right? So that's what it is, balancing and figuring out just how to say that in explicit inclusion exclusion terms. So
this is what you have asked for.
Exactly. No, and that's been very helpful because I think for the second trial that we're running now, we had some discussion and kind of found ways to tweak the criteria, working with you to make sure that it was just a little bit broader. So it was a little bit easier to identify those people.
Great. Now, at the beginning, you said, right, that sometimes, right, it's not ideal to run like a huge study at the beginning, right? And actually, we are seeing many brands that as their first study want a randomized control study, right, placebo controlled with 100, 200, sometimes 300 participants. Obviously, we established already you're a big fan of crossover studies, right? Also on a smaller scale. And what would you say to somebody that actually thinks about clinical studies, in black and white? I either run, right, this full-blown RCT with 200 participants minimum or no clinical study. What would you say to them?
I think I would say don't think that way, because I think it's all about kind of sources of information, right? And so it's like that, like a phase 3 clinical trial for a drug, or pharmaceutical company that involves, many different locations, that involves, tons of participants. That's fantastic, right? That's great, right? But that's a phase 3 trial, right? It took a long time to get there before they actually got to that point. And so there's like scientific evidence is never black and white. It's kind of always a journey to the truth, right? So we don't for us, we don't plan to stop at running, our clinical trials for a PMS product. We hope to run additional clinical trials and placebo-controlled RCTs and get bigger, because we want additional evidence that we can take to MDs or healthcare providers. But if you've never run a clinical trial before, and you're not an expert in it, probably, or even if you are, right, there's probably going to be something that you do that you design the criteria a little bit wrong, or you're asking the questions in a slightly the wrong way, or you try some blood tests and you actually wanted a different biomarker for your trial. And if you just jump from 0 to 100 miles an hour because you go from no clinical trial at all for your data to something that is absolutely gigantic, placebo-controlled, all these sorts of additional criteria, then you're putting yourself at a lot of risk. It's kind of like a rocket ship, right? You want to make sure that you fine tune as much as possible before you commit fully. And so I think the intermediate trials are really helpful because you find things that you would do differently as you grow your trials. And so don't just jump to the huge thing, unless maybe you're coming from Pfizer, right? And you have an enormous budget, or your Procter & Gamble, right? You have this absolutely gigantic budget for trials and you've done a lot. But even then, they would know to do intermediate steps, right? Because everybody does intermediate steps in science. And if you don't, you're going to mess up in a way that's going to leave you very disappointed. And I think as well, especially for consumer goods and supplements and wellness products, it's also hard to develop a true placebo control, right? So it's like, if you're doing something with a skincare product, to have the same texture, to have the same appearance, to have the same smell, for a face cream that's your placebo versus your intervention is really hard. Even for supplements or capsules, it's easier. But if you're because you can coat them, you can make them look similar, you can make sure people don't break them up and try and taste the powders. But if you're doing like a drink or something, that's going to be impossible, right? Because you can't get the two products to taste the same.
I think even in drug trials, right? Everybody always knows what the placebo is.
They do, right? They do as much of a time as possible, hard of a time. But it's like, we had a bunch of friends involved in, COVID vaccine trials, right? Well, if you have a flu feeling after your shot, probably you got the, intervention, right? Because it's really hard it's worth doing the placebo controlled, but it's hard to have a good placebo.
Yeah. Absolutely. Now let's take a step further, right? So we just talked before we started this workshop about clinicaltrials.gov, and that it's great that we are seeing more and more brands, publishing also their studies on clinicaltrials.gov. But what we are also seeing is that sometimes brands are a little bit hesitant to put their studies actually out there on clinicaltrials.gov, even though you don't have to publish anything, right? So can you tell us a little bit more why you decided to put your study or studies on clinicaltrials.gov and why this is important for you?
Absolutely. So, and this comes back a little bit to brand identity as well, because, because of personal experience. our goal really is to try and kind of raise the level of products and kind of options for women with different, sources of discomfort. So for us, it was really important to try and be as transparent as possible, right? And clinicaltrials.gov is a government-run website where they ask people who are running clinical trials to submit what they're going to run their clinical trials on, right? And so it's not mandated. Even pharmaceutical companies don't necessarily have to submit their data. They don't even have to submit to it. But it's one of those things that shows that you're kind of doing all your trials in good faith, because you're submitting your data before your trial is completed, ideally, and saying, hey, everybody, we're running this trial, we're doing it in this way, and there's a transparency involved with it. And so that's what I really like about it. You don't have to publish results. It's almost impossible to find results if you search there. We'll be publishing ours, but it's something that is nice because it shows kind of the step of honesty towards the community that you're being open. And so in the same way that, and I think consumers, they don't know about clinical trials yet, but I think .gov yet, but I think as this becomes more and more popular, it will be something that is an additional reputational boost, because it shows that you are being transparent with your consumers, right? Because running a clinical trial can be a little scary. Like, I remember before we got our final report, you're always nervous, right? If you're not nervous, then you're not doing a clinical trial properly. But by putting things out there, it's a boost for consumers, because they know that you're not running a trial, but you're being transparent about what you're running, right? Because consumers aren't dumb, right? They know that there's an incentive for brands to manipulate the data or kind of fudge things as much as possible. And so kind of, if you're on this call, then that means that you want to raise the level. You want to be more transparent with your customers. You want to show them that there is scientific evidence for your products. And so I think putting your experiments on your trials on clinicaltrials.gov is good for that, because it shows trust. And also it's helpful, right? Because it's like when our trial completed, right, we searched clinicaltrials.gov to see if there was any other PMS supplement that had been done a clinical trial, right? And there wasn't anything there. So we were able to say, hey, we're the first IRB approved clinical trial for PMS supplement that is available, right? Because we searched through everything that was there, and there was nobody, right? And now I think there's a couple more, which is great, right? And that's really exciting. And I think that's wonderful, because anyway, I really like the idea of transparency and openness, and I think your consumers appreciate that as well.
Nice. You led the way, which is awesome.
Thanks. It's great. I mean, that's what's fun, right? It's like, I think, and even like, yeah, if you want advice on to run a clinical trial, just reach out to me as well, right? We can tell you our experience and give you some advice or something, because in a way, like, probably none of us on this call are actually competing with each other. We're competing with people who are selling bad products that don't work, right? So that's the other person out there.
And because you mentioned publishing, right? A lot of brands, they want their results published in a top-notch journal. So my question for you, and this is actually the last set of questions we are talking about, do you want that too, to be in a top-notch journal? I assume yes. And if yes, what is your strategy to tackle this? And what do you think are the biggest challenges to actually achieve this?
That's great. Yes, I absolutely want our data published. My previous life was an academic. I published tons of papers, and I think the peer review process is really helpful and really important. And I think that's honestly, that's the next level of data quality, right? Because it's like there's the first thing of doing, independent clinical trial, something like Citruslabs, and then there's the next level, and then submitting it to clinicaltrials.gov to be open, publishing your results right on your own website, being as transparent as possible. So we'll put the final report out, right, that Citruslabs gave us. And then the next is, of course, publishing your data and getting it peer reviewed, right? And so that is definitely what we want. I think, practically speaking, for me, it's just time and energy, right? Because it's like anyone who's in a startup it's getting things published takes a long time in academia, and I don't have enough sources of caffeine to allow me to multitask like that right now. but I think that that should be a goal of everyone doing trials. And I think, so I think the other aspect of that as well is identifying, if you have the time and energy and you know how to get things published, it's really about identifying good journals that are a good fit, and also identifying the sources of scientific data that a journal wants, right? Because it's, if you, for a lot of journals, if you're just doing consumer response data, that's not that interesting to them, right? It's like that's helpful that there is a perceived benefit or something like that, but they want to have some biomarkers that you can suggest are linked to your improved outcome. Or at least, if you're doing, skin or a topical, get like a dermatologist to review and rate all the photos kind of in a blinded fashion, right? So it's like there needs to be something that is more perceived to be more rigorous than just a consumer, than just a kind of a Likert sort of rating scale. And so that's the other aspect, is that if that is really important to you, you have to design your trial with that end goal in mind, because you need certain types of data and information to be able to make it through the peer review process with a high impact journal.
And you need to invest a little bit more, right? Because then you have to invest in biomarkers. For skincare, you have to invest in potential expert skin grading, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And so that's, And so I think if that's really important to you and you have the budget, go for it. But I also would suggest that could be part of an additional later study, right? That's the thing is that none of these things are kind of the be all and end all. I think it is something where it's like, if you've never run a trial before, if you're not sure about kind of the design of it, you can run a first trial and get some data that you can use in advertising, or to kind of validate your thought process. And then the next trial, you can make it bigger, you can make it more robust, you can include, tweak the things that failed, kind of. Maybe your inclusion criteria included some people that were just not quite correct or something, right? And then you can include the biomarkers and include the additional sort of aspects. But we keep doing lots of biomarker data with our trials because we love them. And so our next trial, we're getting even more biomarker data, and Citruslabs has been great, working with that and figuring that out. So maybe do as I say, not as I do, because we love biomarker data.
Yeah, and it has been great working with biomarkers, especially with you guys, because sometimes, right, so for biomarkers, with Semaine, we are using finger prick tests because they are consumer friendly. People can take them in the comfort of their own home, right? We do have specific days when they need to take them, but it doesn't matter if they take them in the morning or at night, for example. They can take them in their home when they are ready, basically, right? Whereas, some markers you actually have to get, a venous blood draw, and that's when things get a little bit more complex. But obviously, can be done.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great thing as well, right? Because it's like, and that's an aspect of your trial design, right? Is like how annoying do you want to make it for your participants, right? Because for me, there are some blood draw markers that I would have loved to have gotten, right? But it's the pandemic, right? The pandemic seems like it's never going to end, right? Do people really want to be driving somewhere to go get their blood drawn for a random trial? That's really annoying. And so there are trade-offs you have to make, but the kind of the fingerprint blood spot sort of like data that you can get a lot of biomarkers now. It's a little bit noisier. It's not quite as accurate as like a venous draw, but they do give a lot of good data. And the consumer friendliness of it is really nice, because these are people who are trying to advance scientific discovery. Unless you really need the venous draw, then make it easy for your participants.
Great. Make it easy for your participants. Make it easy for our audience. We had the 41-minute mark. So let's get over to questions from the audience, I would say.
So go ahead, anyone, if you do have any questions, go ahead and throw them into that Q&A section right now. I have both the Q&A and the chat windows up, so you can utilize either one of those right now and go ahead and throw some questions in there, and we'll get those read for you. So this one looks like the first one is for Matt. So Astrid is asking, how much did your first clinical trial cost?
I feel like that's don't ask certain people the salaries how much it cost. It was working with Citruslabs was really great because they're kind of built around kind of like fully remote clinical trials. And so, and about, exactly, yes, how much is my salary? so I think I'll let Susanne answer that more in kind of a general context, because our trial did have some specific design criteria, and it was a lot more reasonable than a lot of other trials that we looked into because of the fully remote aspect and kind of how they structure their trial design. And so that has been very, yeah, so it was very cost effective, but I'll let Susanne answer that.
Yeah, so typically a study that, Semaine was running would cost at least like 200,000, if not like more in the 500,000 range, if you would go with like a traditional CRO. Our clinical studies, they typically start at 25,000, but they don't include biomarkers. So if you want to, include biomarkers, if you want to include like more rigorous screening, more rigorous inclusion, exclusion criteria, right? Or even, run the crossover design, right? Then typically it gets a little bit more expensive, but I think it's still really good compared to other companies that are out there and running clinical studies. Obviously, it is a hard question, because every study is customized, right? No study is the same, even though maybe they look the same, right? They are not, because there are many different nuances to it. Do you use validated questionnaires? Do you use study-specific questionnaires? Do you use biomarkers? If yes, how many, right? Because, for example, Matt's first study didn't include as many markers as, right, the next study. The next study is full of biomarkers. Where are they even called?
All of them. So,
exactly. So these are all like little nuances that can impact the price.
All right. So our next question is from Ness, and it's asking what was the impact on your sales before and after the study? And that one obviously looks like it's for Matt.
So, like running a e-commerce business right now it's if anyone is doing that, right, there's lots of confusing things with iOS and all that sort of stuff. So our sales has been great. After the study, it's hard to always disentangle and tease out like a single variable like that. We haven't, the study just wrapped up relatively recently, and we are working on incorporating all the results in our advertising claims and pushing that as well out to our retail partners and making that a part of kind of the retail pitches as well. And so unfortunately, as much as I would like to be able to kind of isolate the impact of a single variable on our performance, I can't. I do know that it has been a significant impact as well in our retail discussions. So, we're talking to, numerous drug partners, drug retailers, and it's been helpful for them to hear about our trial and our trial design and kind of the results of it, because so that's probably the easiest thing to single out, would be that when we've been talking to large drug retailers, that they are excited to hear about that. And then, of course, we are building that out into all of our packaging and kind of the advertising space as well. So, sorry, that was nebulous, but that's the best answer I can give.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. So the next one here looks like this is for Susanne. So what is the geographical scope of these studies? Do we do US only, or can Citruslabs also do Canadian studies as well?
We typically do US only, and we can do nationwide depending on what the needs are, right? If somebody needs to go, for example, to see dermatologists, we can recruit different dermatologists all over the country, but typically it's like 2 locations for this type of studies, because they're not that large, right? Or if you need like your blood drawn somewhere, right? We work, for example, with Quest LabCorp. We also work with home phlebotomy that can facilitate that as well. But Canada, I think we have done a couple of studies in Canada. We don't prefer it, but we can do it. And yeah, so that's the answer to that question.
All right, perfect. So we have the next question here. This one is for Matt. What is the time, or I guess either one you could really answer this, and maybe, so what is the time from initial engagement to recruitment launch, and maybe even expand on that a little bit and just talk about kind of the whole study timeline?
So for us, so just given my background, I actually write all of our clinical trial, the documents that we submit for the IRB, just because that's kind of in my wheelhouse, given my past life. And so I care about that a lot as well. That honestly takes me the longest amount of time. So often Citrus is like waiting for me to finish up the trial. Once that's kind of completed, it's a relatively quick process. I feel like it's been, a week or two for kind of the finalizing the questionnaires and kind of putting together patient-facing materials, and then maybe another week of getting the IRB approval, and then launching it is pretty close after that. So I feel like it's once I'm kind of done with my part, it's been about a month, and I think that's part of that as well is because the biomarkers that I'm interested in has slowed things down a little bit. But yeah, I'd say about a month, kind of from once you're ready to actually do it to when it starts patient recruitment. But that would also depend, I think, on how aware you are of that kind of trial you want and the design aspects. So yeah, so I guess Susanne, maybe if you want to answer if someone comes in completely, without an idea, how long that takes.
Yeah, so that is typically what we see. It's like a month from you coming to us, right? You want to do a study, then typically what we do if you're not like Matt, right, and design your study and do everything yourself, we talk to you about the goals of your study, the claims you would like to make, if you want to publish it in a journal, all of that stuff. And then based on that, our team of medical writers, biostatisticians, they will create the first drafts of the protocol, right? Study design protocol, the other study material. And then it's like a back and forth with you to actually make sure that we actually capturing everything correctly, what you had in mind. And typically that is about a 4-week process until we can actually launch and launch first IRB, and then IRB typically takes a week. And then after that, start recruitment. And recruitment typically doesn't take too long either.
Depending, of course, on how many people we're looking for, right? Of course. Okay, so next question here we got from Matt. How have the clinical trials changed your conversations with healthcare professionals? Have study results convinced them in prescribing or recommending your product?
That's a great question, and that's because that is kind of our long-term objective. So I think so getting someone to prescribe is a very high bar, right? Because it's like prescription or anything like that would be like a long ways off, right? We need a lot more clinical data for that. What it has been very useful with is definitely in one, marketing directly to healthcare professionals as consumers, because there's a lot of MDs and NPs and RNs out there that are interested in these sorts of products, and also kind of more natural approaches. So that has been very helpful, because marketing to them as a consumer group is kind of the first step. And then as well, we have so not so much for prescribing the product, but for recommending it as an option, right? So that's kind of what we're going for, is to persuade healthcare professionals that we have done enough work and that we care enough about kind of the design and safety and tolerability of all the supplements we're putting in, and that we're doing clinical trials, so that this is another option for some of their patients if they're looking for something and they don't want to take a pharmaceutical approach. And so that has been very helpful with that. I would say, in addition to kind of what the clinical trials themselves, I've got some very detailed documents that we put together for kind of design process for the individual supplements, in terms of why we included specific ingredients, kind of the doses we selected, citations of the journals that have studied the ingredients in it's just by itself, and kind of for safety and those sorts of aspects as well. And so the goal is to kind of put all this into kind of a uniform sort of dossier to, as when we discuss with healthcare professionals, that it's that the different types of evidence kind of layer on top of each other. And so kind of a single, sort of observational or, crossover trial will not be enough to persuade any healthcare professional, definitely not to prescribe, right? Because that is, a much higher bar, but you will be able to persuade them that you're taking it seriously and that they might consider it either as a consumer or also as a potential option for their patients. And that's why we plan to continue clinical trials, right? Because it's like that the first trials we ran for the PMS product is not the end all and be all, right? We're going to run additional trials because our goal is to eventually be something that to kind of grow that trust with MDs and NPs and RNs.
Excellent. And then it looks like, let's see, next question here we have, for Susanne, what IRB do you use?
So we are not using academic IRBs. We have done that in the past, and we don't have time to wait 6 months for an IRB approval. We actually use private IRBs. So the biggest example right now on the market, I think, is Advara, right? We've worked with them, and then we're also working with a couple of smaller IRBs as well. Typically, it's also, all IRBs are the same, right? It's not that if you go with one IRB, this is better than going with, the other IRB. They are all doing the same thing. They are all, right, IRBs doing their job in looking at the studies from an ethical perspective. And typically, we go with the most cost-efficient IRB.
All right. So these ones, looks like a two-part question here from Matt. So how far along in the product development process were you before you identified a need for or initiated the clinical trial? And then also, did you find that you needed to alter the product after the clinical trial was completed?
Those are great questions. So we we were very far along in product development in terms of the fact that we'd already launched the product and we're selling at major retailers and stuff like that before we decided to do a clinical trial. I'd always had the goal of doing clinical trials because I think it's important. It's helpful if you're going to say you're science backed. It's like to kind of raise that bar, right? So we always had that as an objective. It was something as well, though, that it was, we wanted to make sure that at least that we had moderate product market fit, right? That it was a product that consumers liked, they were buying before we invested in a clinical trial. And also, initially we didn't have funding available to run a clinical trial. And so for us, it was, and I would say for most people, I would suggest launching your product, formulating it, develop it, test on yourself, your friends, everybody, launch it, kind of grow the business some, and then launch a clinical trial because you need to make sure that it is a sustainable product and a sustainable business. And part of that as well, and that's why I think it is so important to run tests on yourself and your friends and to kind of internally test your products, because that question about altering your product, right? That's really, that'd be the scariest thing, right? Is that you invest all this, you launch a product, you're on this clinical trial, and then you decide you want to change the formulation, right? Which means that all your data from your clinical trial, you can't use for advertising or support really. And so I think that that's something that you want to, if you want to, we haven't needed to change our, formulation because the product works well. But that's why I would say you don't want to run a clinical trial without having done some of the intermediate steps leading up to it, because you want to be confident that your product works for its intended purpose, and that you aren't going to be making significant alterations to it after the fact. If that helps.
All right. So let's see. Next question here. This one is for Susanne. Do you also help with publishing results in peer-reviewed journals, or do you plan to offer this service in the future?
Right now we don't, because as Matt, mentioned earlier, it takes a long time. It's a huge process, and we can offer it, right? But it costs a lot of money. And most of the brands we worked with that actually asked for this, we gave them a proposal for it, decided not to do it because it is really expensive. However, there are other avenues how you can actually publish results, right? And we talked about this. You can publish your results on clinicaltrials.gov, for example, which adds like another layer of transparency. You can publish your clinical study report on your website, right? We publish stuff that, obviously if you agree, right, we publish your study on our website, right? We publish everything from the methodologies that were used, right? Results, all of this. So they are more avenues to actually publishing results than just going after a journal, right? And you can even publish it and have like a PR, press tour, for example. You can even talk to magazines like Forbes, for example, right? Talk to them about your clinical study and just get the word out that you did a clinical study. It's on clinicaltrials.gov, results are on clinicaltrials.gov, right? And then just talk to as many news outlets, for example, as possible about your study. And, hopefully somebody is, then peer reviewing it and publishing it in their journal then as well.
And just related to that as well, I think it's important to think about kind of the kinds of evidence that you want and who you're persuading, because no consumer is ever going to read, I read tons of peer-reviewed papers, right? But no consumer is ever going to go and read your peer-reviewed paper. If it goes through all those hoops, right? And that takes a year or two for a PhD to publish a paper. So a consumer won't care about that. If you're going to be going after healthcare professionals and healthcare providers, then that's important, right? If you want to kind of go after them as people, as not just as consumers, but as possibly recommending it in your practice, then that's really important, right? Because they trust those kinds of evidence and they know what it means to kind of go through those hoops. But no consumer will ever know the difference between you publishing your results, putting on clinicaltrials.gov, or talking to a publication about it, right? Only do the peer review process if either you really, really believe in it and it takes a lot of time, or if you're going after a consumer group or experts like MDs or something like that who know what it means to be published that way.
All right, that actually looks like that is all the questions we have. So unless anyone else has anything they want to throw in here, it looks like we ran through all these. Yeah, looks like we're all set, guys.
Great. Thank you so much for participating. I will share a recording of this after.